Pamela Cabriales built a life defined by immense resilience, ambition, and a profound dedication to her family. At 32 years old, she stood as a pillar of strength within her community in Denver, Colorado. The Cabriales family was unfortunately no stranger to the devastating impacts of violence. In 1994, Pamela's brother was murdered, inflicting a deep and enduring trauma on the entire household. Rather than allowing this early tragedy to paralyze her or define her world with bitterness, Pamela consciously channeled her energy into creating a stable, joyful environment for those around her. She relied heavily on her surviving brother, Alex Cabriales, and the siblings forged an unbreakable bond rooted in their shared understanding of loss. However, Pamela was a mother first and foremost. Her 5-year-old son, Leo, was the undisputed center of her universe. Every professional endeavor and personal sacrifice was made entirely with his future in mind. Friends and family consistently described Pamela as possessing a heart of gold, a woman who radiated warmth and made an immediate impact on anyone she met. She had a unique ability to make brand new acquaintances feel as though they had known her for decades, an attribute that served her perfectly in her professional life. Professionally, Pamela was a driven and fiercely adaptable entrepreneur. She initially found significant success as a dedicated sales consultant for the international beauty brand Mary Kay. She rapidly climbed the company ranks, demonstrating a natural aptitude for networking and authentic client relations. However, her personal ambitions continued to evolve. And with a passionate interest in interior design, Pamela realized she possessed a sharp eye for transforming spaces. She decided to merge this creative passion with her sales acumen by transitioning into the highly competitive Denver real estate market. Around 6 years prior to her death, a close mutual friend, Letitia Maximova, helped her secure an entry-level position in a local real estate office. This pivotal opportunity allowed Pamela to learn the complex intricacies of the housing industry from the ground up. She studied tirelessly, quickly earned her own real estate license, and began building a promising career. She loved the intricate process of helping families find their forever homes, expertly combining her foundational sales expertise with her intuitive eye for design. By early 2021, Pamela had hit a sweet spot of professional and personal success. She was a financially independent professional, a deeply devoted mother, and a fiercely loyal friend. Her life was characterized by continuous upward momentum, built entirely through her own relentless hard work and an unyielding, protective commitment to her son. In sharp, devastating contrast to the bright trajectory of Pamela's life was the grim reality of 14-year-old Remy Cordova. Born into a profoundly fractured environment, Remy's childhood was a meticulously documented catalog of systemic failures, chronic neglect, and severe trauma. His mother, Christina Cordova, was a young parent who struggled significantly to provide any semblance of stability. She later openly admitted in a court of law that she lacked the necessary financial help and community resources to raise a child, though she maintained that she tried her best. Compounding the severe instability in the home was the total permanent absence of Remy's biological father. Remy never had the opportunity to build a relationship with him, a situation made tragic and permanent when his father was murdered. The violent loss of a parent ironically mirrored the historical tragedy within the Cabriales family, but the respective outcomes for the two individuals could not have been more different. From the time Remy was a small infant, his family had repeated extensive contact with County Child Protection Services. His highly formative years were defined by an endless cycle of bureaucratic interventions that ultimately failed to rescue him from a toxic environment. Defense attorneys would later thoroughly list years of deeply disturbing incidents detailing severe neglect and abuse that began shortly after he was born. The trauma inflicted upon him during his most vulnerable years was so profoundly damaging that a presiding judge would later describe his entire existence as thoroughly tragic, stating for the public record that the things done to him should never have happened to any human being. Remy was an undeniable, documented victim of his circumstances long before he ever became a perpetrator of senseless violence. Without a stable home foundation or adequate psychological support to process his grief and abuse, the young boy inevitably sought belonging and physical protection in the unforgiving streets of Denver. By his early teens, Remy had become heavily and dangerously entangled in local gang culture. The streets offered a twisted, conditional sense of family and a clear, albeit highly destructive, social hierarchy. To survive and thrive in this brutal environment, a young gang member needed to project absolute ruthlessness. Street status was exclusively earned through escalating acts of violence and brazen criminal defiance. Remy absorbed these toxic lessons completely. He began actively participating in severe criminal activities specifically to impress older gang members and to formally earn his stripes within the organization. Long before his path ever crossed with Pamela Cabriales, Remy was already intimately known to the local juvenile justice system. He had been arrested and subsequently released from custody on at least 3 separate occasions for the serious charge of aggravated robbery. The family of his future victim would later publicly condemn the broken bonding system that continually allowed a violent juvenile offender back onto the streets. Each individual arrest represented a clear opportunity for the justice system to intervene. Yet each time, the judicial mechanisms meant to rehabilitate or securely detain him fell tragically short. He was repeatedly cycled back into the exact same volatile environment that was rapidly shaping him into a killer. By the cold winter of February 2021, at just 14 years old, Remy Cordova was heavily armed, entirely desensitized to violent crime, and actively seeking fresh opportunities to prove his unwavering loyalty to his gang. The lives of Pamela Cabriales and Remy Cordova represented 2 drastically different, wholly incompatible realities coexisting within the very same city limits. Pamela was the walking embodiment of the American dream, a resilient woman who had systematically overcome familial tragedy to build a thriving career and a secure home. Remy was the dark product of total societal neglect, a broken child raised in the haunting shadow of murder, abuse, and unchecked gang violence. The physical geography of Denver would soon force these 2 disparate worlds to violently collide. In the immediate days leading up to the fatal intersection, Pamela was entirely focused on her bright future. She was expertly balancing her real estate property showings, and nurturing her growing interior design projects, and lovingly caring for young Leo. The ongoing global pandemic had isolated many individuals, and she was incredibly eager to reconnect with her closest support system. She and her trusted friend Letitia Maximova realized they had not seen each other in several months. They excitedly decided to plan a dedicated girls' night out to properly celebrate their enduring friendship and their respective career successes. They purposefully chose Ocean Prime, a highly upscale, elegant seafood and steakhouse located in the bustling heart of downtown Denver, as the venue for their long-awaited reunion. The evening of February 20th, 2021, was meant to be a purely joyous, carefree occasion. Pamela dressed up meticulously for the dinner, happily leaving her daily responsibilities behind for a few hours of well-deserved relaxation. Throughout the expensive meal, the 2 friends laughed endlessly, shared personal stories, and thoroughly caught up on life. Pamela spoke highly enthusiastically about little Leo's latest developmental milestones and clearly outlined her expanding vision for her independent real estate business. Letitia would later vividly recall that Pamela was radiantly happy that night, projecting the exact same magnetic warmth that had always defined her core character. While Pamela was thoroughly enjoying her sophisticated dinner in the secure safety of an elegant downtown restaurant, Remy Cordova was actively navigating the freezing streets of Denver with a vastly different, highly sinister agenda. He was riding as a front-seat passenger in a dark Honda sedan driven by an 18-year-old criminal associate named Nishan Johnson. The two heavily armed teenagers were aimlessly cruising the sprawling city, deeply steeped in the highly volatile, aggressive mentality of active gang life. Inside the confined cabin of the vehicle, the 14-year-old Remy was armed with a high-powered military-style AR-15 rifle. The terrifying presence of such a lethal weapon in the small hands of a young teenager underscored the severe escalation of his criminal involvement. This was absolutely not a standard weapon carried for basic self-defense. It was a high-capacity instrument of war held tightly by a traumatized boy, desperate to permanently solidify his violent reputation among older, hardened gang members. The atmosphere inside the dark Honda was incredibly tense and highly predatory. The two teenagers were not merely commuting from one location to another, they were actively occupying a dangerous state of hypervigilance, eager and ready to perceive any minor slight or random interaction as a direct, actionable challenge to their fragile street status. As the late evening slowly progressed, the celebratory dinner at Ocean Prime finally concluded. Pamela and Letitia walked out into the crisp Denver air, their personal spirits incredibly high after several hours of deep connection. Letitia affectionately walked Pamela to her parked vehicle, a luxury Range Rover, and the two close friends exchanged warm goodbyes. Before finally parting ways in the dark parking lot, Letitia specifically asked Pamela to send a quick text message as soon as she arrived home safely. Pamela readily agreed with a smile, got behind the steering wheel, and confidently began her routine drive back to her suburban residence. She smoothly navigated the familiar downtown streets, eventually making her steady way toward the busy intersection of Colfax Avenue and Interstate 25. She was completely alone in her quiet car, likely reflecting peacefully on the pleasant evening and eagerly anticipating returning to her sleeping son. At exactly the same chronological moment, the dark Honda sedan carrying Nishan Johnson and Remy Cordova was rapidly approaching the very same intersection. The two gang-affiliated teenagers were suddenly stopped at a glowing red light, the massive AR-15 resting ominously within the tight cabin of the idling vehicle. Remy, thoroughly conditioned by a short lifetime of brutal trauma and the ruthless doctrines of inner-city gang culture, was entirely primed for sudden violence. He was a boy who had been systematically abandoned by every single societal safety net, fully transformed into a willing soldier for a street gang, and casually handed a weapon capable of immense destruction. Pamela Cabriales, conversely, was entirely unaware of the extreme danger lurking just a few feet ahead of her bumper. She was a dedicated mother, a loving sister, a successful real estate agent, and a loyal friend, simply driving home in the quiet hours of the winter night. The traffic light at the intersection of Colfax Avenue and I-25 glowed a bright, unwavering red against the dark Colorado sky. Pamela's vehicle steadily approached the stopped, idling traffic, rapidly closing the physical distance between her hard-won, peaceful existence and the chaotic reality of a heavily armed 14-year-old boy. The fatal stage was now permanently set for a minor driving error to trigger a wildly catastrophic reaction, forever binding the loving legacy of the Cabriales family to the devastating systemic failures that ultimately produced Remy Cordova. Yielding red, illuminating the frost-kissed asphalt and enforcing a mandatory pause in the steady rhythm of the Denver night. It was approximately 10:45 p.m. on Saturday, February 20th, 2021. For the young mother sitting patiently behind the wheel of her heavy SUV, The glowing signal was nothing more than a momentary delay on the familiar, comforting route back to her family. But to comprehend the sheer devastating randomness of this exact geographic convergence, the timeline of the evening must be traced back through the preceding hours, a timeline that highlights a chilling dichotomy between innocent, joyful celebration and a roaming, aimless malice. Earlier that evening, Pamela Cabriales had stepped out into the crisp Colorado winter air, happily leaving the demanding pressures of her bustling professional life behind for a few precious hours. At 32 years old, she was navigating the prime of her life with a hard-earned, radiant grace. Her career as a real estate agent was thriving, requiring an exhausting schedule of constant networking, endless property showings, and high-stakes client negotiations. Yet, despite the aggressive rigors of the highly competitive Denver housing market, her ultimate priority remained firmly anchored at home with her 6-year-old son, Leo. She had recently achieved a monumental personal milestone by purchasing her very first home, a tangible testament to her independence, her financial acumen, and her tireless work ethic to provide a better, infinitely more secure future for her child. This particular Saturday evening was thoughtfully designed to be a brief respite from those heavy responsibilities, taking the form of a well-deserved dinner outing with a close friend and colleague. Inside the warm, dimly lit interior of the restaurant, the atmosphere had been restorative and perfectly insulated from the cold reality of the streets outside. Over the clanking of silverware and the quiet chatter of other patrons, Pamela had shared stories of her recent professional triumphs, her optimistic aspirations for the coming year, and fond, familiar anecdotes about her boy. The evening was characterized by easy laughter, the comforting presence of good company, and the secure feeling of a woman who had successfully built a beautiful, stable life entirely on her own terms. Every sacrifice she made, every long hour she worked, was meticulously calculated to ensure that little Leo would never want for anything. As the dinner eventually concluded and the check was settled, the two friends said their goodbyes and parted ways into the freezing February night. Pamela wrapped her coat tightly against the biting chill and walked confidently across the parking lot to her vehicle, a heavy 2008 Land Rover Range Rover SUV. Climbing into the driver's seat, as she turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life as the heater quickly began to combat the winter frost settling on the glass. The heavy doors closed with a reassuring thud, creating a quiet, insulated sanctuary of leather and steel. She merged effortlessly onto the Denver streets, the radio softly playing in the background. Her mind was likely transitioning away from the pleasantries of the dinner conversation and shifting steadily toward the comforting routine of returning home to check on her sleeping son. She navigated the city's illuminated grid with the relaxed, automatic muscle memory of a longtime local resident. The powerful headlights of her Range Rover sliced cleanly through the darkness as she eventually oriented her route westward toward Colfax Avenue. There was absolutely no reason for her to anxiously check her rearview mirror for threats. She existed in a reality where extreme danger was an abstract concept, not a tangible, lethal force actively maneuvering just a few miles away. Miles across the same city grid, a diametrically opposed reality was currently playing out inside the cramped interior of a dark-colored Honda Accord. Behind the steering wheel sat 18-year-old Nashon Johnson, navigating the urban sprawl not with the straightforward intent of a traveler heading toward a specific destination, but with the restless, hyper-vigilant energy of a predator patrolling its territory. The Honda Accord moved erratically, occasionally cutting off other drivers and disregarding the established rules of the road. In the passenger seat beside him sat Remy Cordova. At merely 14 years old, Cordova's chronological age was entirely betrayed by the hardened, nihilistic posture he had willingly adopted. While other boys his age were typically consumed by video games, homework, or school sports, Cordova was already deeply entrenched in the toxic, violent posturing of gang culture. He was a child wrapped in an oversized facade of lethal intent, desperate to aggressively prove his worth. The cabin of the Honda Accord was entirely devoid of the warmth, laughter, and optimism that had defined Pamela's dinner just a short distance away. Instead, the air inside the small sedan was thick with tension, aggressive bravado, and a chilling detachment from fundamental human empathy. Resting comfortably within the immediate, effortless reach of the 14-year-old passenger was a fully loaded AR-15 rifle. Of the terrifying presence of this high-powered military-style weapon fundamentally transformed the dark Honda sedan into a rolling, mechanized instrument of war. The sheer weight and mechanical complexity of the rifle stood in grotesque contrast to the small, unformed hands that gripped it. The teenagers were not commuting through Denver. They were hunting. The previous night they had already demonstrated a shocking, reckless willingness to escalate minor conflicts into lethal threats, having allegedly been involved in an altercation at a local fast food drive-thru where shots were violently fired into the establishment. Emboldened by that unchecked violence and suffering absolutely no immediate consequences, they spent the evening of February 20th blindly roaming the asphalt arteries of the city. Their minds were actively poisoned by a highly volatile mix of adolescent immaturity, destructive gang ideology, and the supreme unearned power granted by the heavy firearm resting in the footwell. They were aggressively looking for an excuse, seeking out any minor slight or perceived disrespect to assert their dominance and unleash the destructive capability of the rifle. As the late night deepened and the city traffic began to thin, the entirely separate timelines of the successful, loving mother and the armed, agitated teenagers began to fatally bend toward one another. Pamela's Land Rover cruised steadily along the illuminated roads, her path inevitably intersecting with the broader, busier corridors of the downtown infrastructure. Colfax Avenue, famously known as a pulsing artery of neon lights, late-night storefronts, and a constant stream of vehicular traffic, was an environment where paths inevitably crossed. Simultaneously, the dark-colored Honda Accord aggressively wove through the surrounding traffic, its occupants scanning the adjacent lanes with a paranoid, adrenaline-fueled aggression. The physical geography of Denver, with its intricate network of intersecting grids, busy thoroughfares, and sprawling interstate off-ramps, served as the invisible funnel that relentlessly drew these two wildly disparate vehicles together. As Pamela approached the complex, multi-lane interchange where the brightly lit stretch of Colfax Avenue meets the towering concrete infrastructure of Interstate 25, the natural flow of the traffic patterns forced the surrounding vehicles to compress, decelerate, and align. The blinding glare of streetlights and the sea of red taillights created a confusing, high-contrast visual landscape. The Honda Accord ended up navigating directly into the immediate vicinity of the heavy Land Rover SUV. The precise mechanics of the next few seconds remain a tragic alignment of physics and positioning. Whether due to a slight miscalculation of braking distance in the dark, the unpredictable stop-and-go nature of the interstate off-ramp traffic, or a simple, momentary lapse in spatial awareness, the heavy front end of Pamela Cabrioles's Range Rover made a minor, almost imperceptible contact with the rear bumper of the Honda Accord. The sound of the collision was likely nothing more than the dull crunch of plastic and fiberglass, a low-speed impact that barely registered against the heavy suspension of the luxury vehicle. In a normal society, this incredibly minor fender bender would equate to nothing more than a brief spike of adrenaline, the frustrating exchange of insurance information, a polite apology, and a minor delay in the evening schedule. But for Nishan Johnson and Remy Cordova, the slight physical jolt to the frame of their vehicle was not interpreted as an everyday traffic accident. It was immediately processed as the ultimate, unforgivable disrespect they had been actively seeking to punish all night long. The bright, unyielding red light at the intersection now held both vehicles securely in a forced, inescapable standstill. Pamela sat comfortably behind her steering wheel, likely sighing at the minor inconvenience of the bump, entirely blind to the horrifying reality unfolding just inches past her windshield. She could not possibly fathom that inside the dark sedan stopped directly ahead of her, an agitated 14-year-old boy was tightly gripping the cold metal of an AR-15, actively preparing to interpret a harmless traffic mishap as a definitive act of war. The stage was set, the vehicles were locked in place by the traffic signal, and the final seconds of Pamela Cabrioles's peaceful evening began to rapidly tick away in the cold Denver night. Reality unfolding inside the dark four-door Honda positioned directly in front of her. The location was the intersection of West Colfax Avenue and Interstate 25, a busy concrete-heavy transit corridor in the heart of Denver. It was a cold February night, and the ambient glow of street lamps and traffic signals cast long, unnatural shadows across the asphalt. Inside the Honda, the atmosphere was thick with an aggressive, predatory tension. The minor impact to the rear bumper had sent a subtle physical vibration through the chassis of the car, a kinetic transfer of energy that immediately triggered a lethal psychological response from its occupants. Sitting in the front passenger seat was 14-year-old Remy Cordova. Despite his youth, Cordova was fully immersed in a subculture that equated minor slights with mortal combat. He turned his head away from the dashboard, looking across the center console toward the driver. Behind the wheel sat 18-year-old Nation Johnson, an older companion who commanded a higher degree of respect and authority within their shared gang hierarchy. Cordova's hands were not empty. They were firmly wrapped around the cold, machined metal of an AR-15 style rifle. The teenager had allegedly referred to the high-powered firearm as his toy, a chilling mischaracterization of a weapon engineered for maximum battlefield lethality. Cordova locked eyes with Johnson and posed a simple, terrifying question. He asked, "Can I bust on them?" The query was a direct request for authorization to deploy deadly force. In the confined, tense space of the idling vehicle, Johnson possessed the authority to de-escalate the situation, to instruct the younger boy to put the rifle down, or to simply step on the accelerator and drive away when the light turned green. Instead, Johnson embraced the violence. He looked at the 14-year-old and replied, "Do what you gotta do, that's on you." Those exact words served as the ultimate catalyst, severing whatever fragile restraint remained. The heavy, a metallic clack of the passenger side door handle echoed inside the cabin as Cordova pulled the latch. The door swung outward, cutting through the cold winter air, and the 14-year-old stepped out onto the paved surface of Colfax Avenue. He stood up to his full height, his physical stature contrasting sharply with the massive tactical profile of the assault rifle he carried. To an outside observer, the silhouette would have been deeply incongruous, a boy barely out of middle school wielding a weapon designed for infantry engagements. Yet his movements were deliberate, devoid of hesitation or youthful uncertainty. He planted his feet on the roadway, placing himself squarely in the gap between the rear bumper of the Honda and the front grille of Pamela Cabrioles's SUV. Inside her vehicle, Pamela's reality shifted in a fraction of a second. The expectation of a frustrated driver emerging to inspect paint damage or exchange insurance documentation was instantly annihilated by the sight of the dark, elongated barrel of a rifle rising toward her windshield. She was boxed in, trapped by the unyielding red light, the concrete barriers of the interstate interchange, and the idling traffic surrounding her. There was no physical space to maneuver the SUV, no time to throw the transmission into reverse, and absolutely no avenue of escape. The gap between the two vehicles offered no cover, leaving her entirely exposed behind the fragile barrier of automotive safety glass. Cordova raised the stock of the AR-15, settling the weapon against his shoulder. He leveled the muzzle, aiming the high-powered rifle directly at the front windshield of the SUV, aligning his sights with the driver's seat where Pamela sat trapped. His finger slid inside the trigger guard. He applied pressure, fully intending to unleash a devastating volley of gunfire into the cabin. He pulled the trigger. However, instead of the concussive, deafening blast of a high-velocity round detonating in the chamber, the night was met with a hollow, metallic click. The weapon did not fire. The safety mechanism, a small selector switch engineered to prevent unintentional discharges, was still engaged. This mechanical failure created a profound, fleeting pause in the timeline of the attack. It was a microscopic window of opportunity, a fraction of a second, where the universe imposed a physical barrier between intent and execution. In that silent beat, Cordova had the opportunity to recognize the gravity of his actions. He was standing in the middle of a major Denver intersection, pointing a firearm at an unarmed woman over a scratched bumper. The failure of the weapon offered a chance to retreat, to lower the rifle, turn back to the Honda, and walk away from the threshold of murder. But the 14-year-old exhibited no such reflection. There was no internal hesitation, no sudden influx of panic or remorse. Frustrated by the mechanical impediment, Cordova fluidly lowered the rifle just enough to manipulate the controls. His youthful fingers found the selector switch on the side of the receiver. With a swift, practiced motion, he flicked the safety off, disengaging the only remaining barrier between life and death. Cordova raised the AR-15 for the second time. He re-established his sight picture, aiming directly at the glass barrier separating him from his target. This time, when he pulled the trigger, the weapon performed exactly as its manufacturers intended. The cold, quiet atmosphere of the February night was violently ruptured by the ear-splitting crack of the first round. The sound echoed with concussive force off the concrete pillars and retaining walls of the Interstate 25 overpass. Cordova did not fire a single warning shot. He unleashed an overwhelming barrage. He held the trigger, allowing the firing mechanism to cycle with ruthless efficiency. The rifle bucked and recoiled against his shoulder, but he maintained his grip, steadying the barrel as he emptied round after round into the front of the SUV. The sheer volume of fire was staggering. Up to 20 shots were expelled from the rifle's magazine in rapid succession. The air was instantly filled with the acrid, sulphurous stench of burning gunpowder and the high-pitched shriek of tearing metal. At least 8 of the high-velocity projectiles found their direct mark on the windshield. The laminated safety glass, designed to withstand the impact of road debris and moderate collisions, offered absolutely no resistance to the military-grade ammunition. The windshield shattered inward, spiderwebbing into a chaotic mosaic of destruction before completely caving under the relentless kinetic energy. The bullets punched through the glass, tearing through the cabin of the SUV with devastating speed. Pamela Cabriales had no defense. The incoming fire struck her with catastrophic force. The clinical reality of the ballistic trauma was absolute. The projectiles inflicted massive structural and biological damage, including a devastating, non-survivable wound to her head. The interior of her vehicle, which just moments before had been a quiet sanctuary after a dinner with a friend, was instantly transformed into a site of unimaginable violence. The rapid succession of gunfire finally ceased, leaving a ringing, heavy silence in its wake. The magazine was severely depleted, or Cordova simply deemed his violent task complete. He lowered the smoking barrel of the AR-15. He did not approach the shattered SUV to inspect the devastation he had wrought. The visual confirmation of the destroyed windshield and the motionless figure inside was entirely sufficient. He turned his back on the horrific scene and walked back toward the open door of the Honda. He climbed into the front passenger seat, pulling the heavy rifle into the cabin with him. The door slammed shut, sealing the occupants inside their getaway vehicle. However, the aggression had not completely burned out. As the Honda idled in the intersection, Cordova positioned the weapon one last time. He extended the barrel of the AR-15 out of the open passenger side window, aiming back at the disabled SUV. He squeezed the trigger, firing two final parting shots into the mangled chassis of Pamela's vehicle, a chilling punctuation mark on the massacre. Without waiting for the light to cycle, Nishan Johnson slammed his foot down on the accelerator pedal. The engine of the dark four-door Honda roared to life, its tires screeching and biting into the asphalt as it aggressively launched forward. The vehicle tore through the intersection of Colfax Avenue and I-25, accelerating rapidly as it fled the scene. In seconds, the tail lights of the Honda shrank into the distance, blending into the dark, sprawling grid of the Denver city streets, leaving the epicenter of the destruction entirely behind. Back at the intersection, the environment remained frozen in a state of chaotic suspension. The traffic light, entirely indifferent to the human tragedy that had just occurred, cycled from glaring red to bright green, granting the right of way. Yet, Pamela's SUV remained entirely stationary. The vehicle idled in the middle of the lane, its headlights beaming through the jagged, bullet-riddled expanse of the shattered windshield and illuminating the empty patch of asphalt where the Honda had been parked just moments prior. In the surrounding lanes, the civilian witnesses who had been waiting out the red light were plunged into a state of profound, paralyzing shock. The driver of the vehicle positioned directly behind Pamela's SUV, who had miraculously avoided being struck by the sheer volume of high-powered rounds tearing through the air, sat immobilized by the sheer terror of the proximity to the gunfire. The sharp, unmistakable scent of spent ammunition hung heavy and suffocating in the winter air. Inside the surrounding cars, trembling hands frantically fumbled for cell phones. The harsh glare of screens illuminated panicked faces as fingers dialed for emergency services. Frantic voices began flooding the dispatch center, desperately attempting to articulate the incomprehensible violence they had just witnessed. The geographic coordinates of Colfax Avenue and Interstate 25 rapidly transitioned from a standard metropolitan traffic stop into an active, sprawling homicide scene. The minor fender bender, a harmless bump that would typically warrant a cursory glance and an exchange of insurance cards, had been entirely erased. It was permanently replaced by the grim, immovable reality of a young mother bleeding out in the driver's seat, her life brutally taken by a 14-year-old's chilling desire to prove his capacity for slaughter. Colfax Avenue and Interstate 25 were immediately broadcast across police radio frequencies, transforming the initial confusion of civilian reports into a highly coordinated law enforcement mobilization. Dispatchers, trained to maintain a steady and clinical cadence amidst unfolding chaos, relayed the critical details to every available unit in the central Denver sector. The priority was absolute: an active shooter event stemming from a vehicular collision with at least one victim confirmed down. The first patrol cruisers arrived at the intersection within minutes of the initial frantic emergency calls. Red and blue emergency lights sliced through the darkness of the freezing February night, reflecting off the shattered safety glass that coated the asphalt. Officers swiftly positioned their heavily armored vehicles to block westbound traffic in Lane 3, establishing a rigid and defensive perimeter around the stationary 2008 Land Rover SUV. Approaching the vehicle with weapons drawn and flashlights piercing the dark interior, the horrific reality of the seemingly random attack became immediately apparent to the responding officers. 32-year-old Pamela Cabriales remained slumped in the driver's seat. She was completely unresponsive, having sustained at least one catastrophic gunshot wound to the head. The interior of the luxury SUV was a scene of immense devastation, with the cold winter wind blowing through 8 distinct bullet defects punched straight through the shattered windshield glass. Blood pooled heavily on the premium leather seats, a stark visual indicator of the sheer lethality of the weapon utilized against her. Paramedics from the Denver Health Paramedic Division arrived moments later, their heavy ambulance navigating aggressively through the rapidly accumulating bottleneck of stopped civilian vehicles. First responders immediately executed an emergency medical extraction, carefully but rapidly moving the critically wounded real estate agent from the blood-soaked driver's seat onto a waiting gurney. The clinical urgency of the paramedics contrasted sharply with the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled environment of the surrounding crime scene. They administered advanced life support protocols directly on the frozen asphalt, applying trauma dressings and securing her airway before swiftly loading her into the brightly lit back of the ambulance. Sirens wailed with deafening intensity as the emergency transport rushed toward the trauma bay at Denver Health Medical Center. Her prognosis was categorized by attending physicians immediately as extremely critical, and the massive tissue damage inflicted by the high-velocity rifle rounds left her clinging to life by the thinnest of physical threads. Back at the intersection of Colfax and Interstate 25, the Denver Police Department initiated a full-scale forensic lockdown. Crime scene technicians and homicide detectives systematically gridded the roadway to preserve the physical evidence of the unprovoked slaughter. Illuminated by high-intensity portable floodlights, investigators placed bright yellow evidence markers next to spent ammunition casings scattered aggressively across the pavement in front of the Land Rover. The distinct dimensions of the recovered brass identified them as .223 caliber shell casings, confirming the terrifying detail that the shooter had utilized an AR-15 style assault rifle in a densely populated urban intersection. Detectives immediately began separating and interviewing the traumatized motorists who had dialed emergency services. Eyewitness accounts provided a unified and horrifying narrative. Following a minor rear-end collision where the victim's Land Rover tapped the suspect's bumper, a young male suspect exited the passenger side of a dark-colored four-door Honda Accord. The assailant stood adjacent to the victim's vehicle, methodically lowered the weapon's safety, and mercilessly fired multiple rounds directly into the occupied cabin. The suspect then retreated to the Honda, which rapidly fled westbound down Colfax Avenue into the night. Dispatchers cross-referenced this specific vehicle description with recent stolen vehicle and active crime reports. They quickly identified a dark Honda Accord connected to a violent incident at a McDonald's drive-thru on West Alameda Avenue the previous evening. An urgent alert was transmitted to every active patrol unit in the Denver metropolitan area, providing the specific Colorado license plate associated with the stolen Honda and warning officers that the occupants were armed with an assault rifle and highly dangerous. The search grid expanded rapidly throughout the city as midnight approached and the temperature continued to drop. The critical breakthrough in the manhunt occurred on February 21st at approximately 12:01 a.m., barely an hour and 15 minutes after the deadly barrage of gunfire on Colfax. A sharp-eyed Denver police officer, identified in subsequent arrest affidavits as Officer Phillips, was actively patrolling the darkened surface streets when she observed a dark Honda Accord matching the suspect vehicle's exact description. Falling in at a discreet distance behind the sedan, Officer Phillips verified the alphanumeric sequence on the Colorado license plate against the hot sheet provided by dispatch. The visual match was absolute. She immediately keyed her shoulder radio, airing the suspect vehicle's precise information, current location, and northbound direction of travel to the communications center. With backup units converging rapidly on her coordinates to form a tactical net, Officer Phillips activated her overhead emergency lights and blaring sirens to initiate a high-risk felony traffic stop. The driver of the Honda, 18-year-old Nashawn Johnson, I absolutely refused to yield to the overwhelming police presence. Instead of decelerating and pulling to the shoulder, Johnson slammed his foot on the accelerator, initiating a desperate and highly dangerous vehicle pursuit through the residential and commercial thoroughfares of the city. At precisely 12:03 a.m., dispatch audio recorded Officer Phillips stating the suspect car was traveling at extreme high speeds northbound on Tejon Street, blowing completely past the illuminated intersection at Alameda Avenue. The Honda recklessly weaved through the nighttime environment, its tires screeching against the cold pavement, as the occupants realized the full weight of the Denver Police Department was aggressively closing the distance. The pursuit was violent, but ultimately brief. Unable to maintain control of the stolen sedan at such reckless velocities, Johnson ultimately lost control of the Honda Accord. The vehicle careened off the roadway, sending the sedan violently crashing into a stationary obstacle and rendering the engine completely inoperable in a cloud of smoke and crushed metal. The twisted frame of the wrecked Honda had barely settled before the passenger doors swung violently open. 3 young males scrambled from the disabled vehicle, sprinting frantically into the cold darkness of the neighborhood in a desperate bid to evade immediate capture. The pursuing officers did not blindly rush into the darkness. Instead, they immediately established a rigid and heavily armed containment perimeter, effectively locking down the surrounding city blocks to prevent any possibility of escape. Understanding the extreme tactical danger posed by heavily armed fleeing suspects who had already demonstrated a calculated willingness to kill a civilian, the command staff deployed specialized tactical resources. Heavily armored SWAT operators and specialized K-9 units arrived on the scene within minutes, utilizing advanced tracking techniques, floodlights, and thermal imaging equipment to systematically clear the cordoned area yard by yard. The coordinated tactical search quickly and efficiently yielded results. The highly trained police dogs tracked the fresh scent of the fleeing suspects through the urban landscape, leading tactical officers directly to their concealed hiding locations. Surrounded by heavily armed police and barking canines, the suspects realized their evasion had failed. Within a short period, while law enforcement successfully apprehended all 3 individuals without further lethal violence. The 18-year-old getaway driver Nishan Johnson, the 14-year-old shooter Remy Cordova, and a second unnamed 14-year-old juvenile who had been riding as a passenger in the back seat. They were immediately detained, aggressively searched for secondary weapons, placed in double-locked handcuffs, and secured into the back of separate patrol cruisers. The clinical efficiency of the midnight apprehension was deeply juxtaposed against the chilling and unrepentant demeanor of the primary shooter. As hardened detectives processed the 14-year-old murder suspect, Remy Cordova displayed an absolutely unsettling lack of remorse for the immense devastation he had just unleashed on West Colfax Avenue. Sitting in police custody, the teenager callously bragged to law enforcement personnel about his high-powered weapon, casually referring to the lethal AR-15 rifle used to execute Pamela Cabriales as his personal toy. He further articulated his twisted and sociopathic motivation to the arresting officers, stating plainly that the horrific act of violence was committed specifically to earn his stripes and elevate his violent status within the local East Side Cripps Street gang. The immediate aftermath of a minor, everyday traffic collision had rapidly concluded with 3 teenagers in handcuffs, a specialized military-style rifle recovered by forensic teams, and an innocent young mother lying completely motionless in an intensive care unit hospital bed, fighting a brutal medical battle she would tragically lose just days later. The day following the execution of 32-year-old real estate agent Pamela Cabriales at the intersection of West Colfax Avenue and Interstate 25, the Denver Police Department remained locked in a high-stakes manhunt. The vital breakthrough in locating the perpetrators did not originate directly from the homicide investigation, but rather from a separate outbreak of gang violence. A patrol officer observed a suspect vehicle matching the description of a car involved in a recent drive-by shooting at a local fast food restaurant. Unbeknownst to the pursuing officer, the individuals occupying this fleeing vehicle were the exact same teenagers responsible for the devastating AR-15 rifle attack the previous night. Recognizing the police presence, the 18-year-old driver Nashawn Johnson initiated a desperate vehicular pursuit through the winter-slicked streets of the city. The chase was frantic and ultimately short-lived. According to the subsequent analysis, Johnson attempted to navigate a sharp turn to evade the flashing lights, but the icy asphalt proved too treacherous. The suspect vehicle skidded completely out of control, violently striking a pothole and flipping up before crashing and becoming entirely disabled. Knowing they were cornered, the occupants abandoned the wreckage. Johnson 14-year-old Remy Cordova and a third unidentified juvenile passenger sprinted away from the crash site, on foot disappearing into the frozen yards of a nearby residential neighborhood. Law enforcement rapidly established a heavy tactical perimeter to contain the fleeing fugitives. The focus of the Special Weapons and Tactics teams immediately shifted to a specific property containing a detached backyard wooden shed. It was within this localized containment area that authorities would secure the definitive physical evidence linking the teenagers to the murder. During the exhaustive search crime scene, technicians and tactical officers recovered the firearms utilized during the crime spree. Among the seized weapons were the high-powered AR-15 style rifles. The physical discovery of these lethal firearms underscored the severe threat the fleeing suspects posed to the surrounding public. Inside the abandoned getaway vehicle, investigators located a chaotic scene of scattered shell casings. The presence of spent .223 caliber ammunition littered throughout the cabin provided a direct ballistic link to the barrage of up to 20 rounds of gunfire that had claimed the life of the victim. The physical recovery of the AR-15 rifles transformed the trajectory of the investigation, shifting the focus from a blind manhunt to a targeted tactical extraction. The tension of this apprehension is permanently preserved and thoroughly documented through the clinical analysis of police station body cam footage and the tactical cameras worn by the arresting officers. As the heavily armed SWAT team closed in on the residential perimeter, the recorded audio captures the sharp commands of officers coordinating their approach in the freezing air. The body-worn cameras document the systematic clearing of the residential yard. Police canine units were deployed to track the fresh scent of the fleeing suspects, leading the handlers directly to the flimsy wooden doors of the backyard shed. The footage reveals the chilling reality of the standoff as SWAT operators surrounded the structure where the teenagers had taken refuge. The heavy darkness of the shed interior was suddenly pierced by high-intensity tactical flashlights mounted to the barrels of the officers' weapons. In the confined space, the blinding beams of light illuminated the hiding suspects crouched on the dirt floor. The body cam video captures the exact moment of realization for the cornered fugitives as the harsh light reflects off the scattered shell casings they had carelessly carried with them. The audio tracks the authoritative commands from the SWAT team, ordering the individuals to crawl out of the shadows and surrender their hands. They were dragged from the shed, placed in heavy metal handcuffs, and transported directly to the downtown Denver police station. Further analysis of the body cam and station hallway surveillance footage reveals the rapidly shifting demeanors of the suspects once they were securely in police custody. The adrenaline-fueled bravado of the street chase rapidly evaporated, giving way to the stark reality of the holding cells. The transition from heavily armed fugitives to detained suspects is documented in high definition, setting the stage for the psychological maneuvering that would define the interrogation phase. Once isolated in separate and austere interrogation rooms, the suspects immediately recognized the catastrophic severity of their legal situation. The strategy for each teenager quickly devolved into a desperate attempt to shift the blame, and minimize their own direct culpability in the homicide. The recorded interrogation sequences provide a clinical look at the mechanics of self-preservation among violent accomplices. 14-year-old Remy Cordova presented a complex picture during his initial time in the holding room. In a rare moment of vulnerability captured on the wide-angle surveillance camera, the teenager wept openly to his mother, apologizing to her for his dire situation. He was recorded uttering a tearful apology, but the emotional display vanished entirely the moment the homicide detectives entered the room to begin the formal questioning. Advised legally by his mother to remain silent, Cordova adopted a hardened and tight-lipped demeanor that belied his young age. When investigators attempted to question him about specific gang affiliations, asking directly if he went by the street monikers Lil Ro or Baby Dro Cordova, stonewalled them completely. He feigned total ignorance, providing dead-end answers and refusing to offer any coherent narrative of the previous night. By refusing to formally answer questions during this specific interview segment, Cordova effectively forced the frustrated detectives to rely entirely on the statements of his co-defendants to build the timeline of the shooting. 18-year-old Nashawn Johnson, however, took a drastically different and highly verbal approach. Aware that he was the adult driver of the vehicle, Johnson attempted to talk his way out of a first-degree murder charge by spinning a convoluted and highly improbable web of transparent lies. As the lead detective patiently took notes, allowing the suspect to speak freely, Johnson began to systematically distance himself from the violence. His primary defense rested on an absurd claim regarding his physical state at the exact time of the murder. Johnson looked the seasoned homicide detective in the eye and stated plainly that he had simply fallen asleep in the back seat of the car. The detective immediately challenged this ridiculous fabrication. The investigator pointed out the sheer impossibility of the timeline, noting that Johnson was claiming to have fallen into a deep slumber within 30 minutes of witnessing a horrific homicide. The detective specifically highlighted the immense auditory trauma of the event, questioning how any human being could possibly doze off in the confined space of a vehicle immediately after a high-powered AR-15 rifle had been discharged repeatedly from the passenger side window. Despite the open incredulity of the detective, Johnson doubled down on his ridiculous story, insisting that he had been resting quietly under a blanket and was totally unaware of the escalating traffic collision until it was too late. When the narrative of sleeping peacefully through a deafening murder failed to gain any traction in the interrogation room, Johnson aggressively pivoted to directly implicating his younger accomplices. He attempted to recast himself as a passive and unwilling participant who had actively tried to de-escalate the violence. He claimed that he had verbally told Cordova to stop playing with the weapon before the trigger was pulled. Furthermore, Johnson tried desperately to explain away the damning physical evidence directly linking him to the firearm. Aware that 2.23 caliber shell casings from the AR-15 had been found on his person and scattered around his specific seat, Johnson accused Cordova of deliberately planting the ballistic evidence. He alleged that after the shooting, Cordova had meticulously gathered the empty hot brass shells and intentionally dropped them onto Johnson to frame the older teen for the gunfire. Johnson also heavily directed the blame toward the third individual in the vehicle, an unnamed juvenile he referred to only as the white dude. He claimed that this third passenger was the one who had initially announced the presence of the illegal gun in the back seat, setting the stage for the tragedy. Johnson painted a completely fictional picture in which he was merely the unwitting driver overwhelmed by the sudden and violent impulses of his heavily armed passengers. He recounted the bizarre moments hiding in the wooden shed, expressing his shock when the SWAT flashlights illuminated the space and detailing his confusion over how a police canine had allegedly sniffed him but walked right past him before the tactical team breached the doors. The interrogation sequences ultimately fractured the fragile unity of the suspects as self-preservation overrode their street loyalties. The third unnamed juvenile, recognizing the catastrophic weight of the impending murder charges, chose to keep his story incredibly straight and consistent from the very beginning. By accurately detailing the exact sequence of events and firmly identifying Cordova as the sole triggerman and Johnson as the commanding driver who authorized the shooting, the third passenger successfully navigated the interrogation without absorbing the primary murder charges. This constant shifting of blame provided the investigators with the exact necessary leverage to close the trap. The deeply conflicting stories, the transparent lies about sleeping through deafening rifle gunfire, and the frantic attempts to explain away the scattered AR-15 shell casings cemented the prosecution timeline. The physical recovery of the high-capacity rifles, the undeniable ballistic evidence left inside the wrecked car, and the meticulous documentation of the body cam footage perfectly corroborated the fact that these individuals had operated as a lethal synchronized unit regardless of their pathetic attempts to betray one another in the police station. With the interrogation concluded and the shifting narrative successfully leveraged by investigators to establish the exact sequence of events, the legal apparatus of Denver, Colorado, turned its full attention to the 14-year-old triggerman. The immediate and primary hurdle for the prosecution was Remy Cordova's chronological age. Under standard judicial procedures, a 14-year-old offender is automatically routed through the juvenile justice system, a framework designed fundamentally around rehabilitation rather than punitive incarceration. However, the sheer brutality of the Colfax Avenue shooting demanded a different approach. The Denver District Attorney's Office swiftly filed a motion to transfer Cordova to adult court. This initiated a highly contentious legal battle, serving as the first major proxy war between the prosecution and the defense before the trial even began. The transfer hearing required a judge to carefully weigh the horrific nature of the unprovoked execution against the biological immaturity of the defendant. The prosecution meticulously laid out the facts of the crime, emphasizing the extreme disparity between the triggering event and the resulting violence. Of firing up to 20 rounds from an AR-15 assault rifle into a stopped vehicle over a minor fender bender demonstrated a level of extreme indifference to human life that transcended typical juvenile delinquency. The prosecution argued that the weapon utilized, the volume of fire, and the resulting death of 32-year-old Pamela Cabriales proved the defendant was operating with the lethal capacity and calculated intent of an adult. The defense countered with standard arguments for retention in the juvenile system, emphasizing adolescent brain development, impulsivity, and the potential for psychological amenability to treatment. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the prosecution, determining that the severity of the charges, which included first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder for endangering the driver of a vehicle directly behind Cabriales, necessitated an adult prosecution. Remy Cordova was officially transferred to the Denver District Court. Pretrial friction escalated rapidly as the defense team attempted to derail the proceedings. They filed a motion to dismiss the charges entirely, accusing Denver District Attorney Beth McCann of prosecutorial misconduct. The defense pointed to public statements McCann made to the news media, wherein she characterized the killing as absolute brutal savagery and described the teenager as capable of cold-blooded murder. The defense argued these statements violated professional ethical rules and a prior gag order, potentially tainting the jury pool and preventing a fair trial. District Judge Darrell Shockley presided over this motion and firmly rejected the defense's stance. He ruled that when the state seeks to treat a juvenile as an adult, it is incumbent upon the prosecution to explain that profound decision to the public. The judge noted that while the language may have been inelegant, it did not rise to the level of misconduct warranting a dismissal. The path to a jury trial was cleared. In October 2024, the trial of Remy Cordova commenced. The courtroom was heavily secured, reflecting the high stakes and the volatile gang dynamics simmering beneath the surface of the proceedings. The prosecution presented a clinical, chronological dissection of the night Pamela Cabriales was murdered. They introduced the physical evidence, the ballistic reports detailing the trajectory of the high-velocity rounds, and the devastating, unsurvivable injuries inflicted on the victim. They also highlighted the extreme danger posed to the surrounding public, firmly establishing the parameters for the attempted murder charge stemming from the stray bullets that struck the vehicle behind the primary target. The core of the prosecution's argument rested heavily on gang affiliation as the primary motive for the execution. They sought to preemptively dismantle any notion that Cordova was simply a frightened child reacting poorly in a stressful situation. Instead, they framed the shooting as a calculated act of violence designed to earn status within the East Side Crips. Through expert testimony and investigative findings, the prosecution detailed the hierarchy of street gangs, illustrating how older members, such as the 18-year-old driver Neshawn Johnson, routinely utilize younger recruits to carry out high-risk violent acts. The prosecution contended that Cordova eagerly seized the opportunity to prove his loyalty and ruthlessness to his older associate. By retrieving a high-powered assault rifle, stepping out of the vehicle, and opening fire over a perceived slight, Cordova was actively demonstrating his value to the criminal enterprise. The state insisted the jury focus entirely on the actions and the lethal intent, stripping away the protective shield of adolescence to reveal a willing executioner who prioritized gang status over human life. In stark contrast, the defense strategy pivoted entirely away from the physical mechanics of the shooting, which were supported by insurmountable forensic evidence and co-defendant statements. Instead, they focused entirely on profound childhood trauma. Cordova's legal team painted a bleak, harrowing picture of his upbringing, attempting to contextualize the extreme violence through the lens of developmental psychology. They introduced records demonstrating repeated systemic failures by child protection services. From the time Cordova was a small child, his environment was defined by severe neglect, chronic instability, and constant exposure to violence. The defense argued that his developing brain was fundamentally rewired by this unrelenting trauma, leaving him hypervigilant, paranoid, and entirely unable to regulate his impulses in high-stress environments. They portrayed him not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a tragic product of a broken societal system. A highly vulnerable youth who was easily manipulated and essentially weaponized by older, hardened gang members who exploited his desperation for belonging. The defense attorneys urged the jury to consider the intense psychological coercion exerted by the older driver in the moments leading up to the gunfire. They suggested that in the warped, authoritative ecosystem of gang life, a 14-year-old child fundamentally lacks the true agency to defy a directive or de-escalate a confrontation. This trauma-informed defense was specifically designed to introduce reasonable doubt regarding the specific, premeditated intent required for a first-degree murder conviction, hoping to mitigate the charges down to a lesser offense, such as manslaughter or second-degree murder. The prosecution systematically countered this narrative during their rebuttal. They reminded the jury that while childhood trauma is a tragedy, it is not a legal justification for executing an innocent mother. The sheer volume of gunfire, the specific choice to employ an AR-15, and the active decision to exit the vehicle to obtain a clear line of sight demonstrated a deliberate, conscious intent to end a human life. In early November 2024, the jury received the case. Deliberations stretched over several days as the jurors carefully weighed the horrific reality of the crime against the complex, tragic background of the young defendant. On a Friday morning, the jury signaled they had reached a consensus. The verdict was read in a tense, silent courtroom. Remy Cordova was found guilty on all major counts, including first-degree murder, first-degree attempted murder, and second-degree murder. The defense's attempt to mitigate the charges through the lens of psychological trauma failed to sway the jury from the ultimate, lethal accountability of the act. The conviction firmly cemented Cordova's status as a violent adult offender in the eyes of the law, setting the stage for a highly consequential sentencing phase. On December 12, 2024, the sentencing hearing convened. The courtroom was saturated with the profound grief of the Cabriales family, who had waited nearly 4 years for this final measure of legal closure. The prosecution emphasized the devastating permanent void left by the murder. Pamela Cabriales was a vibrant, successful real estate agent and a fiercely devoted mother. Her family delivered agonizing victim impact statements that underscored the collateral damage of the shooting. Her ex-husband, the father of her young son, took the stand to detail the deep psychological and emotional struggles the boy has endured since his mother was suddenly and violently taken from him. The family also expressed lingering, bitter anger toward the justice system itself, noting that a juvenile court judge had previously released Cordova on a separate weapons charge prior to the murder, a leniency they firmly believed paved the way for the fatal encounter on Colfax Avenue. Given the standard opportunity to address the court prior to the imposition of his sentence, Remy Cordova delivered a statement that was startling in its defiance. Despite the overwhelming forensic evidence, the corroborated testimony regarding the sequence of events, and the jury's definitive guilty verdict, he steadfastly refused to concede his role as the shooter. Standing before the grieving family and the presiding judge, he attempted to project a sense of empathy while simultaneously denying all culpability. He stated directly to the family that he understood their pain and felt for them, but explicitly declared that he could not take responsibility for something he did not do. This stark, unwavering refusal to accept accountability sent a chill through the gallery, reinforcing the prosecution's portrait of a cold, remorseless offender completely disconnected from the reality of his own devastating actions. Judge Darrell F. Shockley then delivered the final ruling, his closing remarks reflecting the grim, dual nature of the tragedy. He addressed Cordova directly, thoroughly acknowledging the severe and documented failures of the adults and institutions that were supposed to protect him during his formative years. The judge stated with clinical precision that Cordova's life was inherently tragic, validating the defense's assertion that the things that had happened to him and been done to him should never have occurred. The court fully recognized that Cordova's upbringing represented a catastrophic failure of the social safety net. However, Judge Shockley immediately pivoted to the inescapable reality of the crime before the court. The tragedy of the defendant's childhood could not erase, excuse, or mitigate the ultimate tragedy he inflicted upon Pamela Cabriales and her surviving family. The protection of society and the absolute demand for justice necessitated a severe long-term penalty. Under Colorado law, because Cordova was a juvenile convicted as an adult, he was constitutionally spared a sentence of absolute life without the possibility of parole. Instead, the judge sentenced him to life in prison with a highly structured possibility of eventual release. The specific parameters of the sentence mandated that Cordova serve a minimum of 20 years behind bars before becoming eligible to apply for a specialized 3-year educational and rehabilitation program. Upon the successful completion of this program, which requires obtaining a GED and demonstrating significant behavioral modification, he may officially seek early parole. This legal framework effectively results in a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 23 years. The final gavel fell, concluding the legal journey of a minor traffic collision that escalated into a senseless execution, leaving a mother dead, a young child permanently scarred, and a 14-year-old boy condemned to spend his formative adult decades inside a maximum security state penitentiary. By December 2024, the Denver District Courtroom served as the final stage for a tragedy that fractured multiple lives nearly 4 years earlier. Remy Cordova, now 18, sat quietly beside his legal counsel. The boy who pulled the trigger of an AR-15 at 14 had grown into a young man within the confines of the justice system. The sentencing hearing was an assessment of consequence. The atmosphere was heavy, steeped in an exhausting grief that had not diminished since 2021. The wooden benches were filled with the relatives of Pamela Cabriales. They sat in collective mourning, waiting to hear the final judicial decree for the teenager who had stolen the center of their universe. Across the aisle, the reality of a ruined future loomed over the defense table. Before the court handed down its ruling, the defense was given the floor to provide context to the violence. Defense attorney James Zorich aimed to humanize the teenager facing decades behind bars. Zorich methodically detailed Cordova's upbringing, outlining a documented history of severe neglect and profound abuse beginning immediately after his birth. The defense painted a portrait of a child who had fallen through societal safety nets long before he ever picked up a rifle. Zorich addressed the court with a somber recognition of the situation's duality, stating, "This is one of the times when you will see 'victim' next to Remy Cordova's name." The argument sought to explain how a 14-year-old boy could arrive at a place of such extreme indifference to human life, urging a sentence, acknowledging his capacity for eventual rehabilitation. Denver District Court Judge Darrell Shockley listened intently to the proceedings, absorbing the weight of the testimonies. When addressing Cordova directly, his words were measured, reflecting the profound sorrow of the circumstances. Judge Shockley looked at the 18-year-old and acknowledged the catastrophic environment shaping his early years. "Your life is tragic," the judge stated, his voice carrying the clinical yet devastating reality of the defendant's background. He continued, telling Cordova, "The things that have happened to you, that have been done to you, should have never happened or been done to anyone." Yet, the judge recognized the absolute necessity of accountability. The trauma Cordova endured did not erase the trauma he inflicted. Balancing the scales of justice required navigating the space between the boy failed by society and the teenager who fired a deadly weapon into a stranger's car. Given the opportunity to speak before the sentence was formalized, Cordova stood to address the court and the family of the woman he killed. Dressed in standard detention attire, the teenager turned his attention to the gallery where Pamela's loved one sat. The moment offered a chance for remorse, but Cordova's statement provided a frustrating denial of full culpability. "I'm terribly sorry for the pain that you guys feel," Cordova said, his tone steady, "but I cannot take responsibility for something that I did not do." Despite the physical evidence and the jury's conviction, the teenager maintained his innocence. He continued, "And I truly hope that someday, throughout me appealing cases, or whatever this is, that y'all are truly able to get through your grief and understand that I'm not the monster or the murderer that I have been painted to be by Denver's District Attorney Office." For the Cabriales family, this refusal to accept absolute responsibility only deepened the sting of their loss. Following the statements, Judge Shockley delivered the final mandate, and the gavel fell on a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole. Under the strict parameters of the law, Cordova faced a minimum of 23 years behind bars before any realistic opportunity for release could materialize. He also received a consecutive 8-year sentence for an attempted murder charge relating to the driver in the vehicle behind Pamela. The structure of the sentence ensured Cordova would remain incarcerated until his late 30s, effectively stripping away his youth and young adulthood. Granted credit for the 4 years he had already served while awaiting trial, the state of Colorado ensured a significant price would be paid for the extreme violence committed on Colfax Avenue, neutralizing the threat Cordova posed while adhering to constitutional mandates governing juvenile offenders. The true weight of the hearing was anchored by the devastating victim impact statements. Alex Cabriales, Pamela's brother, stood before the court to articulate a grief-defying standard measurement. He spoke of a vibrant 32-year-old real estate agent who was the emotional core of their family. "She was the heartbeat of our family," Alex told the judge, his voice echoing with an irreplaceable sorrow. "She was the example of what love and kindness should be in this world. Remy took that from us that night." Alex directed profound anger at the systemic failures preceding the murder, explicitly condemning the juvenile court judge who had previously released Cordova on a separate weapons charge prior to the fatal shooting. "I believe Judge Lori Clark should resign," Alex stated firmly. "There's no way she should be on the bench after having released him so that he could be out to murder my sister." The most harrowing testimony centered on the youngest victim of the crime, Pamela's son, who was merely 5 years old when his mother was killed and had turned 8 by the time of sentencing. Pamela's ex-husband addressed the court, detailing the severe psychological toll the murder extracted from the boy. The child's reality had been shattered, replaced by a lingering separation, anxiety, and profound terror of abandonment. The father shared the heartbreaking questions his son routinely asked. "Who's going to take care of me if you die, Daddy?" The boy would express his grief in simple terms, telling his father, "I'm sad because I don't want to lose you," or asking agonizing questions like, "What was Mommy's favorite color?" The child frequently woke up in the middle of the night, crying in sheer panic, terrified that an unseen danger was coming for his remaining parent. The psychological scars extended far beyond Pamela's young son. The entire Cabriales family found themselves trapped in a state of hypervigilance. Alex described the lingering aftermath as a form of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Relatives reported waking up abruptly in the darkest hours of the night, their minds paralyzed by the sudden, irrational fear of a break-in or random act of violence. The senseless nature of Pamela's murder left her loved ones acutely aware of life's fragility. If someone they loved could be executed at a traffic light for absolutely no reason, the fundamental illusion of safety was permanently shattered. A district attorney, Beth McCann, encapsulated this profound loss in her official statement. Pamela Cabriales was a loving, joyful, and hard-working young woman who would be with us today, were it not for Mr. Cordova's entirely senseless actions the night of the murder, McCann stated. As the hearing concluded and the gallery emptied, the stark reality of the proceedings settled over the courtroom. Remy Cordova was led away in handcuffs, remanded to the custody of the Colorado Department of Corrections. His path forward was strictly delineated by concrete walls, steel doors, and the distant prospect of a parole board hearing. He would spend his prime adult years confined, isolated from the world he violently disrupted. For the Cabriales family, walking out of the courthouse doors provided a different kind of finality. The legal chapter had closed, but their sentence was permanent. There would be no eventual release from the void Pamela left behind. They were forced to return to a life where holidays and quiet moments would forever bear the heavy silence of her absence. The justice system rendered its final verdict, balancing the tragic origins of a juvenile offender with the finality of a murder. The shattered pieces of the lives left behind would remain fragmented forever.